On the endless white expanse of the Arctic, where survival depends on reading signs most people would never notice, Nayak discovers something that shouldn't exist. Buried beneath 3 feet of ice and snow lies a metal safe, its surface eaten by decades of frost and neglect. The 50-year-old Inuit hunter has seen many strange things during his lifetime on the ice, but nothing like this. With the help of his village, Nayak hauls the mysterious safe back to their settlement. For days, they work to thaw the frozen metal, chipping away ice with careful precision. The elders whisper among themselves, remembering old stories of expeditions that never returned home. When the safe finally opens, what they find inside changes everything they thought they knew about their ancestors and the outside world. But what secrets could be so powerful that someone buried them in the most remote place on Earth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The metal groaned as the last of the ice fell away from the safe's hinges. Nayak's weathered hands trembled slightly as he lifted the heavy lid, revealing contents that had waited 70 years to see daylight again. The village council members crowded around him in the community hall, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Inside the safe lay a collection of items wrapped in oiled leather, maps rolled tight with red ribbon, a leather-bound journal with a brass clasp, compass equipment, and several sealed glass vials containing what appeared to be rock samples. But it was the journal that drew everyone's attention first. Anna, Nayak's wife, and the village's only person fluent in written English, carefully opened the weather-stained logbook. Her finger traced the faded ink on the first page as she read aloud. "Property of Dr. James Morrison, lead geologist, Canadian Arctic Expedition 1952, she announced to the gathered crowd. Funded by the Department of Natural Resources under Project Northern Light Classification. The elder Siku stepped forward, his ancient eyes sharp with recognition. At 93, he was the village's living memory, keeper of stories passed down through generations. Morrison, he repeated slowly. I remember that name from my grandfather's stories. White men who came asking questions about the ice, about what lay beneath our hunting grounds. Anna continued reading entries from the expedition journal, her voice growing more concerned with each page. The team had consisted of 5 men. Dr. Morrison, 2 junior geologists, a surveyor, and a government liaison, whose name appeared redacted in black ink throughout the entries. They had arrived in the spring of 1952, ostensibly conducting routine geological surveys for the Canadian government. But the journal revealed a different story. The expedition wasn't routine at all. They were searching for uranium deposits, the precious metal needed to fuel the nuclear arms race that gripped the world in the early years of the Cold War. And according to Dr. Morrison's increasingly excited entries, they had found exactly what they were looking for. May 15, 1952, Anna read. Preliminary surveys confirm substantial uranium ore deposits approximately 40 meters below surface level. Concentration appears commercially viable, possibly among the largest untapped reserves in the Arctic region. Government liaison extremely pleased with findings. Nayak felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. The deposits the expedition had discovered were directly beneath their village, beneath the land where his people had lived and hunted for countless generations. The journal entries continued chronologically, documenting the team's growing understanding of the mineral wealth hidden beneath the ice. But the tone shifted dramatically in later entries. Dr. Morrison's scientific excitement gave way to growing concern and eventually alarm. June 2nd, 1952, Anna continued, received disturbing communications from Ottawa regarding Indigenous population relocation protocols. Government liaison confirms plans to evacuate native settlements within 50-kilometer radius of mining operations. No provisions for compensation or alternative settlements discussed. The room fell silent, except for the whisper of wind against the community hall's walls. Siku's lined face hardened with an expression Nayak had rarely seen from the peaceful elder. June 8, 1952, Anna read, her voice barely above a whisper. Cannot in good conscience participate in forced relocation of indigenous peoples who have inhabited this region for millennia. Attempted to voice concerns to government liaison, but was informed that national security interests supersede local considerations. These people have rights to their ancestral lands. The final entries grew increasingly desperate. Dr. Morrison wrote of heated arguments with the government liaison, of threats against team members who questioned the relocation plans, and of his growing determination to protect the indigenous population from what he saw as a grave injustice. June 15, 1952, Anna read the final dated entry. Have made decision to conceal critical survey data until proper protections can be established for local population. Hidden primary documentation in secure location known only to myself. If something happens to our expedition, someone must ensure these people's rights are protected. The journal ended abruptly. There were no entries after June 15th. And the expedition had officially been declared lost at sea 3 weeks later when they failed to return to their base camp in Churchill. Nayak looked around the room at the faces of his neighbors and friends. The same questions reflected in everyone's eyes. What had happened to Dr. Morrison and his team? Where had they hidden the survey data? And most importantly, did the government still want to claim their land? Tunu Nayak's 25-year-old son broke the silence. Father, what do we do with this information? Before Nayak could answer, someone spotted headlights approaching the village through the darkness outside. The headlights belonged to young Marcus, returning from his hunting trip. But the interruption reminded everyone how exposed they were. Nayak carefully spread Dr. Morrison's hand-drawn geological survey maps across the community hall's largest table, while the others gathered around with flashlights and oil lamps. The maps were works of art as much as science. Detailed charts showing topographical features, ice flow patterns, and most significantly, cross-hatched areas indicating substantial mineral deposits beneath the surface. Anna traced her finger along the carefully drawn lines that marked underground formations. These symbols here, she pointed to repeated markings scattered across the survey area. They represent uranium concentrations. And look at this. The densest concentration of markings lay directly beneath their village. According to Dr. Morrison's calculations, written in precise handwriting along the map's margins, the deposits extended from approximately 30 meters below surface to depths of over 200 meters. The estimated yield, noted in technical terminology that Anna struggled to translate, suggested enough raw uranium to supply a significant portion of North America's nuclear program for decades. Siku studied the maps with the intensity of someone reading prophecy. His weathered finger pointed to landmarks he recognized from childhood hunting expeditions with his own grandfather. Here, he said, indicating a small lake marked on Morrison's survey. This is where my grandfather told stories of the earth spirits sleeping. He said never to disturb the ground near that water because it would anger the spirits who guarded something powerful beneath. The lake was at the center of the largest uranium deposit on Morrison's map. Anna continued reading notations scattered throughout the survey documents. References to Project Northern Light appeared repeatedly, often accompanied by classification stamps and official government seals. One document, partially damaged by moisture but still legible, outlined a comprehensive development plan for the region. Listen to this, Anna said, her voice tight with concern. Phase 1. Complete geological survey and deposit confirmation. Phase 2. Indigenous population relocation to designated reserves, minimum 200 kilometers from extraction sites. Phase 3. Infrastructure development including rail line, processing facilities, and permanent settlement for mining personnel. Tunu picked up one of the smaller maps, this one showing proposed locations for the designated reserves mentioned in the development plan. The areas were barren patches of tundra with no access to traditional hunting grounds, fishing areas, or the seasonal migration routes their people had followed for generations. They wanted to move us to wasteland, Tunu said, anger creeping into his usually calm voice. Places where we couldn't survive using our traditional ways. The village council members exchanged worried glances. Uki, the elected council chairman, spoke what everyone was thinking. Do we think this project was abandoned when the expedition disappeared? Or are we looking at something that might still happen? Nayak found a folder containing correspondence between Dr. Morrison and government officials in Ottawa. The letters, stamped with various departmental seals, revealed the bureaucratic machinery already in motion to claim the land. Relocation orders had been drafted, compensation amounts calculated, and timelines established for the complete removal of indigenous populations from the mineral extraction zone. One letter, dated just days before the expedition's disappearance, was particularly chilling. The government liaison, identified only as Agent Thompson, had written to his superiors expressing frustration with Dr. Morrison's obstructionist attitude and recommending that alternative measures be considered. To ensure project completion, Anna looked up from the documents with troubled eyes. There's reference here to a second cache of information. Dr. Morrison writes about hiding the most critical survey data and documentation in the place where the aurora touches Earth. Elder Siku's expression changed immediately. Those words held deep meaning in their traditional stories. The aurora viewing ground, he said quietly. The sacred place where our ancestors went to speak with the spirits of the northern lights. It's 3 days' journey from here, where the land rises and the lights dance closest to the earth. The implications hung heavy in the room. If Dr. Morrison had hidden additional evidence at this sacred location, it might contain information that could either protect their land rights or reveal dangers they hadn't yet discovered. Nayak rolled up the maps carefully, his mind working through the possibilities. We need to decide whether to report this discovery to the authorities or investigate further on our own first. What if the government still wants this land? Asked Uki. What if finding this evidence brings attention we don't want? Before anyone could answer, the sound of a helicopter's rotor blades echoed across the village from somewhere in the distance. The helicopter passed overhead without landing, but its presence unsettled everyone. At dawn, Nayak and Tunu prepared for a search expedition to locate any remaining traces of Morrison's team. The morning air bit at their exposed skin as they loaded their snow machine with supplies and detection equipment, borrowed from the village's emergency cache. Father, are we sure about this? Tunu asked as they secured their gear. Maybe we should contact the authorities first. Nayak adjusted his snow goggles and started the machine's engine. Your grandfather always said that knowledge shared too quickly becomes someone else's power. We need to understand what we're dealing with before we invite others into our business. They followed GPS coordinates Nayak had calculated from landmarks shown on Morrison's maps, traveling northeast across the frozen landscape toward an area the geologist had marked as Base Camp Alpha. The whole terrain grew increasingly challenging as they moved, away from familiar hunting grounds into territory that saw few visitors even during the best weather. After 3 hours of careful navigation through unstable ice formations, they discovered the remnants of an old campsite partially buried beneath decades of accumulated snow and ice. Tunu began methodically excavating the area, while Nayak used a metal detector to search for buried equipment. The detector's signal led them to a cache of expedition gear preserved in the permafrost. Cooking equipment, surveying instruments, and most significantly, a military-grade radio communication system still wrapped in protective covering. The radio appeared intact, despite 7 decades of exposure to Arctic conditions. Tunu carefully transported the radio back to their temporary shelter, while Nayak continued searching the campsite. Beneath layers of frozen canvas and twisted metal, he found evidence of hasty abandonment. Personal belongings lay scattered, as if the team had left quickly. possibly under duress. Back at their shelter, Tunu's engineering training proved valuable as he examined the radio equipment. The device was more sophisticated than typical expedition gear, clearly military specification with frequency capabilities that suggested official government communication protocols. "This isn't standard geological survey equipment," Tunu observed as he connected a portable power source to the radio's terminals. "This is the kind of communication system they use for classified operations." The radio crackled to life, and after several minutes of adjustment, Tunu managed to access stored recordings from the device's internal memory. The first few transmissions were routine progress reports from Dr. Morrison to his superiors in Ottawa, documenting survey results and expedition status. But the final recordings revealed a dramatically different situation. Dr. Morrison's voice, tight with stress and barely controlled anger, described a confrontation with government agents who had arrived unannounced at the expedition site. "Base command, this is Morrison. Situation has deteriorated rapidly." Agent Thompson arrived with enforcement team, demanding immediate surrender of all survey data and documentation. When I questioned authority for this action, was informed that expedition is now classified under national security protocols. The next recording, time-stamped 12 hours later, was even more disturbing. Emergency transmission. Government team has seized primary documentation and equipment. They're planning to eliminate all evidence of indigenous land rights and proceed with forced relocation immediately. I've convinced them I need additional time to complete mineral yield calculations, but suspect they're growing suspicious of delays. The final recording was barely audible. Dr. Morrison, speaking in urgent whispers, have successfully concealed critical evidence at coordinates Whiskey 7 Alpha, the traditional Aurora viewing ground mentioned by local guide. Documentation includes proof of indigenous land ownership predating Confederation, legal challenges to government authority, and evidence of uranium deposits significantly larger than reported to Ottawa. If something happens to our team, someone must ensure this information reaches people who can protect these communities. The recording ended with sounds of vehicles approaching and Dr. Morrison hastily shutting down the equipment. Nayak and Tunu sat in silence, processing the implications of what they'd heard. The expedition team hadn't simply disappeared. They had been silenced by their own government to prevent interference with a land seizure operation. "The coordinates he mentioned," Tunu said quietly. "Whiskey 7 Alpha. That's military grid reference format." Nayak pulled out Morrison's maps and began calculating the position. The coordinates pointed to the same location Siku had identified as the traditional Aurora viewing ground, the sacred place where their ancestors had communed with the spirits of the northern lights. "We need to get there before anyone else does," Nayak said, rolling up the maps. "If Morrison hid evidence that could protect our land rights, we have to find it." As they prepared to return to the village, Tunu noticed fresh tracks in the snow near their campsite. The distinctive tread pattern didn't match their snow machine or any equipment used by local hunters. Back in the village, Nayak and Tunu shared their discoveries with the council in Elder Siku's home, away from the community hall where conversations might be overheard. Siku listened to the radio recordings with growing concern, his weathered hands clasped tightly around a ceremonial hunting knife that had belonged to his grandfather. The knife was ancient, its bone handle carved with traditional symbols, and its steel blade worn smooth by generations of use. Siku had never spoken much about its history, but as the weight of Morrison's revelations settled over the room, he began sharing stories that had been kept within his family for decades. "This knife has been passed down through 7 generations of my family," Siku said, running his thumb along the carved symbols. "My grandfather told me it always points toward truth, toward places where the earth holds important secrets. He used it to find hunting grounds, water sources, places where the spirits spoke most clearly." Anna leaned forward, intrigued. "You mean it's some kind of compass?" More than a compass, Siku replied. The old ones understood things about this land that we've forgotten. They knew where the earth held power, where the spirits slept, where disturbance would bring consequences. He stood slowly and held the knife flat in his palm. The blade, despite its age, seemed to catch and reflect the lamplight in an unusual way. As Siku turned slowly in place, the knife's orientation shifted, the point consistently indicating the same direction regardless of how he moved. Northeast, Siku said quietly. Toward the place where the aurora dances. The same direction where you found Morrison's hidden cache. Tunu exchanged glances with his father. Elder Siku, are you saying your grandfather knew about the uranium deposits? Not uranium specifically, but they knew the earth held something powerful in that place. The old stories speak of sleeping spirits beneath the viewing ground, spirits that should not be disturbed. My grandfather's grandfather was present when the first white explorers came through this region in the 1800s. They were warned to stay away from certain areas. Siku set the knife on the table, where it continued to point steadily northeast. The stories say that if the sleeping spirits are awakened wrongly, without proper respect and ceremony, they will bring great changes that cannot be controlled. The room fell quiet as everyone contemplated the implications. Their ancestors had known this land held dangerous power long before modern science identified uranium deposits. The traditional warnings weren't superstition. They were practical wisdom passed down through generations who had lived in harmony with forces they understood better than to disturb. What do the stories say about approaching the sacred ground safely? Nayak asked. Proper ceremonies must be performed. Permissions must be asked of the spirits. The approach must be made with respect and clear intentions. Siku picked up the knife again, studying the carved symbols. But there's something else. The stories also speak of a time when outsiders would try to take what belongs to the spirits, and when that time comes, the people must choose between protecting the old ways and protecting themselves. Anna understood the deeper meaning immediately. You're saying we have to decide whether to claim this land using white man's laws and courts, or to protect it using traditional methods. Both paths have consequences, Siku replied. If we use their legal system, we invite their authority over our lives. If we rely only on traditional protection, they may simply take what they want by force. The discussion was interrupted by a knock at Siku's door. Through the window, they could see it was Uki, the council chairman, looking agitated. Emergency council meeting, Uki announced when Siku opened the door. We've got visitors from the government in Yellowknife asking questions about unusual activities in our area. They're specifically asking about any recent discoveries or excavations. Nayak felt his stomach tighten. What kind of government officials? Natural Resources Department, they say. But they're asking the kinds of questions police ask when they suspect someone of hiding. Something? Siku carefully wrapped the ancestral knife in soft leather and handed it to Nayak. Take this with you when you go to the sacred ground. The spirits will know your intentions if you carry it with proper respect. You think we should go ahead with the search? Tunu asked. I think, Siku said slowly, that Morrison's ghost is trying to finish the work he started 70 years ago. And I think if we don't help him, no one else will. The sound of vehicles pulling into the village square reached them through the walls of Siku's home. Through the window, they could see official government trucks with territorial license plates and men in winter gear unloading equipment that looked more suited for surveillance than routine administrative visits. Despite the government presence in the village, Nayak knew they couldn't delay their search for Morrison's hidden cache. That night, under cover of darkness, 4 people gathered at the edge of the settlement. Nayak, Tunu, Anna, and Elder Siku, who insisted on joining despite his advanced age. The spirits won't speak to strangers, Siku had said when they tried to convince him to stay behind. And you'll need someone who knows the proper ceremonies. They loaded their supplies onto 2 snow machines, taking enough provisions for a week-long journey across treacherous terrain. As they prepared to depart, Nayak pulled Dr. Morrison's compass rose pendant from the safe's contents. The brass instrument was beautifully crafted, with intricate engravings around its perimeter and a magnetic needle that seemed unusually responsive to magnetic variations. Morrison's personal navigation tool, Anna observed as Nayak clipped the pendant to his parka. It might be more than just decorative. The compass rose immediately proved its worth as they began their journey northeast toward the Aurora viewing ground. Unlike standard compasses that simply pointed magnetic north, this instrument seemed to detect subtle variations in the Earth's magnetic field. The needle would shift slightly when they passed over certain terrain features, responding to underground formations that weren't visible on the surface. Their first day of travel took them across familiar hunting territory, following game trails and traditional routes that Siku had learned from his own grandfather decades earlier. But as they moved deeper into the wilderness, the landscape became increasingly challenging. Ice formations created treacherous passages, and sudden weather changes forced them to take shelter multiple times. Around their evening fire, Siku shared stories about the Aurora viewing ground that had been passed down through generations of his family. The location wasn't just a place to observe the northern lights. It was considered a sacred site where the physical and spiritual worlds came closest together. My great-grandfather told stories of visions received at that place, Siku said as they huddled around the flames. Visions of events that hadn't happened yet, of changes coming to our people, of choices that would determine our survival. Anna stirred the fire with a stick, sending sparks up into the clear night sky. Do you think Morrison understood the spiritual significance of where he was hiding his evidence? I think he understood more than most white men who come to our land, Siku replied. The way he wrote about protecting our people, about the injustice of forced relocation, suggests he saw us as human beings rather than obstacles to be removed. Tunu consulted their GPS coordinates and compared them to Morrison's hand-drawn maps. We're about halfway there. Tomorrow we'll enter territory that most people never see. As if summoned by his words, the northern lights began their ancient dance across the sky. Ribbons of green and blue light undulated overhead, casting an ethereal glow over the frozen landscape. Nayak noticed that Morrison's compass rose pendant reacted to the aurora display, its needle spinning gently as the magnetic field fluctuations from the lights passed overhead. The pendant is responding to the aurora, he told the others. Morrison must have discovered the connection between the magnetic anomalies and the location of his hidden cache. Siku watched the lights with the reverence of someone who had witnessed this miracle countless times, but never lost his sense of wonder. The ancestors believed the lights were the spirits of those who came before us, dancing to show us the way forward. Maybe Morrison's spirit is dancing up there too, guiding us to what he wanted us to find. Their second day brought more challenging weather and terrain. They encountered unstable ice formations that required careful navigation and several detours around areas too dangerous to cross. The compass rose pendant proved increasingly valuable, helping them identify stable routes and avoid hidden crevasses that could have been fatal. As they climbed toward higher elevation, the aurora became more visible even during daylight hours, faint wisps of light playing at the edges of their vision. Siku explained that this phenomenon occurred only in the most magnetically active areas, places where the Earth's natural energy was particularly strong. Late in the afternoon of their second day, they crested a ridge and saw their destination spread below them. The Aurora viewing ground was a natural amphitheater carved into the mountainside, with stone formations that seemed almost deliberately arranged to frame the northern sky. Even in daylight, the place radiated an otherworldly quality that made them all speak in hushed tones. But they weren't alone. Fresh tracks in the snow showed that someone else had recently visited this sacred place. The fresh tracks led directly to the center of the Aurora viewing ground, where a circle of ancient stones stood arranged in a pattern that seemed both natural and deliberately placed. Siku approached the formation with visible emotion, his eyes wide with recognition and something approaching awe. "I have never seen this before," he whispered, reaching out to touch one of the weathered stones. My grandfather described it in the stories, but I thought it might be legend. The ceremonial stones were unlike anything Nayak had encountered in decades of traveling across the Arctic. Each stone was roughly the height of a person, carved with symbols that appeared to predate any known indigenous writing systems in the region. The symbols seemed to flow around the stone's surfaces like frozen water, creating patterns that shifted depending on the angle of observation. Anna walked slowly around the circle, studying the carvings with the trained eye of someone who had spent years preserving cultural artifacts for the village museum. These symbols don't match any traditional Inuit script I've seen, but they're definitely indigenous work. The carving techniques, the tool marks, everything suggests they're very old. Siku knelt beside one of the stones and began brushing away accumulated snow and ice from its base. As he worked, more symbols became visible, these ones appearing more recent than the ancient carvings above them. "Look at this," he called to the others. "These markings are different, newer." The newer symbols appeared to be directional indicators, arrows, and geometric patterns that had been carved with metal tools rather than the stone implements used for the original artwork. And among the geometric patterns, they found symbols that matched notations on Morrison's geological survey maps. Morrison was here, Tunu said, comparing the carved symbols to his father's maps. He added his own markings to the ancient stones. The compass rose pendant around Nayak's neck began responding more dramatically as they moved around the stone circle. Near the largest stone, positioned at what appeared to be the focal point of the formation, the pendant's needle spun rapidly before settling into a steady pointing direction that led toward a depression in the ground at the stone's base. But before they could investigate further, Siku stood and raised his hand for silence. "We cannot disturb this place without proper ceremonies," he said firmly. "The old stones have been here for generations beyond counting. They were placed by ancestors who understood the power of this location. If we want their permission to uncover what Morrison hid here, we must ask properly." Anna understood immediately. "What kind of ceremonies?" "Blessing ceremony to introduce ourselves to the spirits of this place. Permission ceremony to ask for guidance in our search. Protection ceremony to ensure our actions don't bring harm to our people or to the land." Siku began unpacking ceremonial items he had brought from the village: sweetgrass for burning, traditional tobacco, small carved figurines representing protective spirits, and a drum made from caribou hide. The afternoon light was fading, and he explained that the ceremonies would be most effective during the transition between day and night, when the aurora was beginning to appear. As darkness settled over the viewing ground, the northern lights began their nightly display with unusual intensity. The aurora seemed to respond to their presence, the dancing lights focusing directly overhead in spiraling patterns that created an almost hypnotic effect. Siku began the blessing ceremony by lighting the sweetgrass and walking slowly around the stone circle, allowing the sacred smoke to drift over each ancient marker. He chanted in the old language, words that even Anna couldn't fully translate, but that seemed to resonate with the landscape itself. The permission ceremony followed, with each member of their group placing a small offering of tobacco at the base of the central stone while stating their intentions aloud. Nayak spoke of wanting to honor Morrison's sacrifice and protect their people's land rights. Anna asked for wisdom to understand the significance of what they might discover. Tunu requested strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. When Siku's turn came, he spoke in the traditional language for several minutes, his words flowing like poetry as he addressed spirits that his ancestors had honored for countless generations. As he concluded his offering, the aurora light seemed to pulse in response, creating a moment of connection between the ancient and the present. The protection ceremony was the most complex, involving specific drum rhythms and chanted prayers designed to ensure their actions would bring healing rather than harm to their community. As Siku's drumbeat echoed across the viewing ground, The compass rose pendant began glowing faintly, as if responding to the spiritual energy being invoked. When the ceremonies concluded, a profound silence settled over the viewing ground. Even the constant Arctic wind seemed to pause, creating a sense of expectation that made them all feel they were standing at the threshold of something significant. With the spiritual preparations complete, the northern lights reached their peak intensity, painting the entire viewing ground in ethereal green and blue radiance. The aurora seemed to pulse in rhythm with their heartbeats, and Morrison's compass rose. Pendant glowed with reflected light as it pointed steadily toward the depression at the base of the central stone. Nayak began carefully excavating the area where the pendant indicated, using traditional tools to avoid damaging anything hidden beneath. The permafrost was hard, but after an hour of patient work, his blade struck something metallic. Tunu joined him in carefully clearing away frozen earth and ice until they revealed a sealed aluminum document tube, approximately 2 feet long and bearing multiple government classification stamps. The tube was wrapped in waterproof material and secured with military-grade sealing tape that had remained intact despite 7 decades in the frozen ground. Anna photographed the tube and its markings before they opened it, documenting the official seals and classification numbers that might prove important later. Top secret, Project Northern Light, eyes only, Anna read from the tube's labeling. Authorization Level 7, Department of National Defense, Siku observed quietly as they prepared to open the container. Morrison chose this place carefully. The spirits have protected his secrets. Inside the tube, they found a collection of documents that made Dr. Morrison's original journal seem like a casual observation compared to the explosive evidence he had hidden. The first document was a complete geological survey report showing uranium deposits far more extensive than anything indicated in Morrison's field notes. The deposits stretched across a region encompassing not just their village, but traditional territories of 6 different indigenous communities. But it was the second document that truly shocked them. A classified government memorandum dated June 10, 1952, outlined Operation Arctic Sweep, a comprehensive plan to relocate all indigenous populations within a 500-kilometer radius of the uranium deposits. The relocation wasn't temporary or voluntary. It was designed to permanently remove indigenous peoples from their traditional territories to make way for large-scale mining operations. "Listen to this section," Anna said, her voice tight with anger as she read by flashlight. "Indigenous populations represent ongoing security risk to Project Northern Light operations. Recommend immediate implementation of relocation protocols under Emergency Measures Act. Compensation packages to be minimal, focusing on transportation costs only. No provisions for return to traditional territories. Tunu studied maps included with the relocation plans. They were going to move our people to places hundreds of miles away, to land that couldn't support traditional hunting and fishing. It would have destroyed our culture within a generation." The third document provided the most damning evidence. A legal analysis prepared by the Department of Justice concluded that the planned relocations violated existing treaty obligations and international law regarding indigenous rights. The government's own lawyers had warned that the operation was illegal, but their recommendations had been overruled by national security considerations, hidden among the legal documents. They found Dr. Morrison's personal notes explaining why he had concealed the evidence. He had discovered that Agent Thompson, the government liaison assigned to their expedition, had been specifically instructed to ensure that no information reached the public that might interfere with the relocation operation. Morrison writes here that Thompson threatened to have the entire expedition team declared lost and eliminated if they didn't cooperate with the cover-up, Anna said. He realized they were all in danger the moment they questioned the relocation plans. The final document in the tube was perhaps the most important. a legal deed establishing clear indigenous ownership of the traditional territories, including mineral rights. The deed had been prepared by sympathetic lawyers in Ottawa who understood the implications of the government's illegal plans. Morrison had somehow obtained the document and hidden it with the other evidence, knowing it represented the strongest possible legal protection for the indigenous communities. Siku examined the deed carefully, his weathered fingers tracing the official seals and signatures. This paper says the land belongs to us. Not just the surface, but everything beneath it, including the uranium, Nayak realized. If this deed is legally valid, the government can't take our land for mining without our permission. As they carefully repackaged the documents, the aurora display reached a crescendo that seemed to celebrate their discovery. The lights danced directly overhead in spiraling patterns that created shadows and illumination across the ancient stone circle, as if the spirits themselves were acknowledging the significance of what had been revealed. But their moment of triumph was interrupted by the distant sound of helicopter rotors approaching through the night sky. Someone else knew about their expedition to the sacred viewing ground, and they were running out of time to get Morrison's evidence back to safety. The helicopter circled overhead twice before disappearing into the darkness. But its message was clear. Their expedition was being monitored. Working quickly by flashlight, they secured Morrison's documents and began the dangerous journey back to their village through the night. Taking indirect routes to avoid detection, they arrived home before dawn, exhausted, but carrying evidence that could change everything. Nayak called an emergency community meeting for that evening, giving people time to finish their daily responsibilities while word spread quietly through the village about the importance of attendance. By 8 o'clock, the community hall was packed with nearly every adult in the settlement. Nayak stood before his neighbors and friends, holding the legal land deed that Dr. Morrison had hidden 70 years earlier. The document looked deceptively simple: official government letterhead, formal legal language, and signatures from territorial authorities, but its implications were enormous. This deed establishes our legal ownership of our traditional territory, including all mineral rights beneath the surface, Nayak announced to the assembled crowd. It was prepared in 1952 by lawyers who knew the government was planning to steal our land illegally. Anna read key sections of the deed aloud, translating the legal terminology into language everyone could understand. The document granted comprehensive ownership rights to the traditional territories of their band, with specific provisions protecting against government seizure for resource extraction purposes. According to this deed, any mining or development on our land requires our explicit consent, Anna explained. The government cannot take our territory for national security reasons or economic development without our permission. The room buzzed with excited conversation as people grasped the significance of what had been discovered. But Elder Siku raised his hand for attention, his expression more cautious than celebratory. "This paper gives us power," Siku said slowly. "But power brings responsibility. And it brings danger. We must think carefully about how we use this knowledge." Uki, the council chairman, stood to address the crowd. "We need to discuss our options. Do we immediately contact lawyers and the media to publicize this discovery? Do we negotiate quietly with the government? Do we prepare for a legal battle?" The debate that followed revealed deep divisions within the community. Younger villagers, led by Tunu and several other families with children, argued for immediate public disclosure of the documents. They wanted to claim their rights aggressively and use the legal deed to secure their economic future. "We could be wealthy," argued Mary Kanguk, a single mother struggling to support 3 children. "The uranium under our land could fund education for our kids, healthcare for our elders, housing improvements for everyone. Why should we be cautious about claiming what's legally ours?" But the elders, led by Siku, urged a more measured approach. They worried about attracting unwanted attention from government agencies and mining companies who might find ways to challenge or circumvent the legal protections. "Wealth brings outsiders," warned Thomas Uki's elderly father. "Outsiders bring changes we cannot control. Look at what happened to communities that found oil or diamonds. Are they still living traditional lives? Are their children still speaking our language?" Anna found herself caught between the two perspectives. As someone with legal knowledge, she understood the power of the deed they had discovered. But as someone who had watched other indigenous communities struggle with rapid development, she also understood the elders' concerns. "Maybe we don't have to choose between protecting our culture and claiming our rights," she suggested. "The deed gives us control over development. We could allow limited, sustainable mining that benefits our community without destroying our way of life." The discussion continued late into the evening, with passionate arguments on all sides. Some families wanted to immediately hire lawyers and challenge the government's historical claims to their territory. Others preferred to keep the discovery secret until they could better understand the potential consequences. As the meeting neared its end, young Marcus burst through the community hall doors with urgent news. "Government trucks are coming up the access road," he announced breathlessly. "Official vehicles with territorial plates, and there's a helicopter following them." Through the hall's windows, they could see lights approaching across the tundra. The convoy included several official vehicles and what appeared to be a mobile command unit, suggesting this wasn't a routine administrative visit. Nayak quickly secured the legal deed and other documents, while the community decided how to respond to their unexpected visitors. The weight of Morrison's 70-year-old secret had suddenly become their burden to bear, and they were about to discover whether the outside world was ready to respect their newly proven rights. The convoy pulled into the village square just as the community meeting was ending. 3 black SUVs and a mobile communications trailer arranged themselves in a formation that seemed more military than administrative. From the lead vehicle emerged a tall man in an expensive Arctic parka, followed by 4 associates carrying equipment cases and official documentation. The man approached the community hall with the confident stride of someone accustomed to authority. He knocked firmly on the door before entering without waiting for permission, a breach of protocol that immediately put the villagers on edge. "Good evening," he announced to the assembled crowd. "I'm Agent Thompson from the Department of Natural Resources. We're conducting a routine survey of geological activity in this region." Nayak felt his blood chill at the name. Thompson. The same name that had appeared throughout Morrison's documents as the government liaison who had threatened the 1952 expedition. This couldn't be the same person, but the coincidence was unsettling. Agent Thompson pulled out a leather credential case and displayed a government identification badge with official seals and his photograph. The badge identified him as a senior investigator with clearance for classified resource assessments, exactly the kind of authority that would be involved in uranium exploration. "We've received reports of unusual excavation activity in this area," Thompson continued, his eyes scanning the faces of the villagers with practiced assessment. "Specifically, we're investigating unauthorized disturbance of potentially sensitive geological sites." Uki stepped forward as the elected council representative. "What kind of disturbance are you referring to, Agent Thompson? This is traditional territory where our people have hunted and traveled for generations." "We're aware of your traditional activities," Thompson replied smoothly. "But satellite imagery has detected recent digging in areas that haven't shown human activity for decades. We need to understand what's been discovered and ensure that any findings are properly reported to federal authorities." Anna noticed that Thompson's associates were setting up equipment around the hall's perimeter, devices that looked more like surveillance gear than standard geological instruments. One of the men was discreetly photographing the assembled villagers, while another was deploying what appeared to be electronic monitoring equipment. "Are we under some kind of investigation?" Anna asked directly. Thompson's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Not an investigation exactly, more of a fact-finding mission. We understand that certain historical artifacts may have been discovered in the region, items that could have significance for national resource planning." Elder Siku spoke up from his position near the back of the hall. "This is our traditional territory. We have rights under treaty to travel and hunt, as our ancestors did." "Absolutely," Thompson agreed. "No one is questioning your traditional rights. But if geological discoveries have been made, federal law requires proper reporting and assessment. We're here to help ensure compliance with those regulations." Nayak realized that Thompson was fishing for information, using official authority to pressure them into revealing what they had found. The agent didn't know specifically about Morrison's cache, but he clearly suspected that significant discoveries had been made. "What exactly are you looking for?" Nayak asked. Thompson consulted a tablet computer and showed them satellite images of the Aurora viewing ground. The images clearly showed their expedition tracks, the excavation site, and even their camping area from the previous night. "We know you visited this location recently," Thompson said, pointing to the sacred site on the satellite image. "This area has been flagged as geologically sensitive since the 1950s. Any disturbance requires federal permits and oversight." The room fell silent as the villagers realized the extent of government surveillance. Their expedition to the sacred viewing ground had been monitored from space, their movements tracked and recorded. "We're not accusing anyone of wrongdoing," Thompson continued, "but we need to understand what was discovered at this site, for everyone's protection, including yours." Tunu stepped forward, his young face showing anger at the implied threats. "Protection from what?" Thompson's expression hardened slightly. "Son, there are forces in this world that are bigger than your small community. Resource development, national security, international economic pressures. If significant discoveries have been made on this land, they will attract attention, whether you want it or not. We're offering to help manage that attention in ways that protect your interests." The agent's words carried an unmistakable undertone of threat. "Cooperate with federal authorities or face consequences that the government couldn't control." But before anyone could respond, Thompson's radio crackled with an urgent message that caused his confident demeanor to shift immediately. The urgent radio message that interrupted Thompson's intimidation came from his command trailer outside. After a brief, tense conversation in whispers with one of his associates, Thompson's entire approach changed. He was no longer the confident federal authority figure, but someone who had just received disturbing news. "We'll need to continue this conversation tomorrow," Thompson announced abruptly. "Please ensure that no one leaves the village tonight, and that any discovered materials remain secure until federal protocols can be implemented." After the agents retreated to their vehicles, the villagers remained in the community hall to discuss their response. Nayak knew they were at a crucial decision point. They could comply with Thompson's demands and surrender Morrison's evidence, or they could take a stand to protect their rights. Anna had quietly retrieved one of the most important artifacts from their discovery, the original Union Jack flag that had belonged to Dr. Morrison's 1952 expedition. The flag was faded and weather-stained, but its symbolism was powerful. It represented the colonial authority that had tried to claim their land 70 years ago and was now trying again through different agents using the same tactics. This flag flew over Morrison's expedition when they discovered the uranium, Anna told the assembled villagers. Morrison kept it as evidence of the government's original claims to our territory, but now it can represent something different. Siku understood immediately. A symbol of resistance. The village council convened an emergency session that lasted until dawn. By unanimous vote, they decided to resist federal pressure and assert their rights under the legal deed Morrison had hidden. But they also understood they needed allies and public support to succeed against government authority. Tunu volunteered to secretly contact indigenous rights organizations and media outlets using the village's satellite internet connection. Working through the night, he sent encrypted messages to legal aid societies, environmental groups, and journalists who specialized in indigenous rights issues, and organized the legal documentation, making multiple copies of Morrison's deed and the classified government documents. They created secure storage locations throughout the village, ensuring that if federal agents seized some evidence, other copies would survive. Meanwhile, Nayak and several other hunters established discreet observation posts around the village perimeter to monitor government activities. They discovered that Thompson's team had set up sophisticated surveillance equipment designed to intercept communications and monitor movement. As morning light revealed the full extent of the federal presence, the villagers realized they were essentially under siege. Government vehicles blocked the main access road, and helicopter patrols circled the area at regular intervals. But their resistance preparations had been successful. By dawn, indigenous rights lawyers from Yellowknife were en route to the village. Environmental activists had been alerted to the situation, and most importantly, journalists from multiple news organizations were requesting permission to visit and document the confrontation. Thompson returned to the community hall at mid-morning, accompanied by additional federal agents and what appeared to be legal advisors. His demeanor was more serious than the previous evening, suggesting he had received updated instructions from his superiors. "I'm going to be direct with you," Thompson announced to the hastily assembled crowd. "We know that classified materials have been discovered in this area. These materials relate to national security issues that supersede local authority. We're prepared to be reasonable about compensation, but federal law requires that these materials be surrendered immediately." Nayak stood slowly, holding the faded Union Jack flag that had become their symbol of resistance. "Agent Thompson, this flag belonged to Dr. Morrison's expedition in 1952, the same expedition that discovered evidence of your government's illegal plans to steal our land." Thompson's face tightened at the mention of Morrison's name and the 1952 expedition. "We have documentation proving that your agency has been aware of our land rights for 70 years, Nayak continued. "We have legal deeds establishing our ownership of this territory and its mineral resources. And we have evidence of criminal conspiracy to violate indigenous rights and treaty obligations." Anna stepped forward with copies of the legal deed. "This document, properly filed and witnessed, establishes our legal ownership of this territory, including all subsurface mineral rights. Any resource development requires our explicit consent." Thompson examined the deed with obvious recognition and growing concern. "Where did you obtain these documents?" "From Dr. Morrison's cache," Elder Siku replied. "The place where he hid evidence of your government's crimes against our people." The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching from the direction of the territorial highway. Through the community hall windows, they could see news vans with satellite equipment pulling into the village square. The arrival of news crews transformed the tense standoff into a public spectacle that neither the villagers nor Agent Thompson had anticipated. The lead reporter, Sarah Chen, from CBC Northern Service, stepped out of the first van, carrying professional camera equipment, and immediately began documenting the confrontation. Sarah's camera became the most powerful artifact in the developing crisis. Unlike the maps, documents, and flags that held historical significance, the camera represented the ability to broadcast their struggle to the world in real time. As she began filming the federal agents' vehicles and surveillance equipment, Thompson realized his operation was no longer secret. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area," Thompson called out as Sarah approached the community hall with her cameraman. "Federal investigation in progress," Sarah ignored the warning and continued filming, while her cameraman captured establishing shots of the village under siege. "I'm Sarah Chen, CBC News. We're here to investigate reports of indigenous land rights violations and government overreach in traditional territories." Anna immediately understood the opportunity and approached the news crew with copies of Morrison's legal deed and selected pages from the classified documents. "We have evidence of a 70-year government conspiracy to illegally seize indigenous land for uranium mining." Sarah's eyes widened as she reviewed the documentation. This wasn't just a local land rights dispute. It was a story with national implications involving classified government operations, indigenous rights, and natural resource development. "Can you go on camera to explain what you've discovered?" Sarah asked Anna. Within minutes, CBC was broadcasting live from the village as Anna stood in front of the community hall, holding Morrison's deed and explaining the historical context of their discovery. The camera captured not just her words, but the dramatic backdrop of federal agents and surveillance equipment that validated her claims about government pressure. This legal deed, hidden for 70 years, proves that our community owns this territory and its mineral resources, Anna said directly into the camera. "The Canadian government has known about our legal rights since 1952, but they've attempted to proceed with resource extraction anyway." Thompson attempted to intervene by claiming that live broadcasting violated federal investigation protocols. But Sarah's cameraman continued filming as the agent became increasingly agitated. The footage of a federal official trying to silence indigenous people asserting their legal rights became powerful visual evidence supporting the village's claims. As the CBC broadcast went live across Canada, other news organizations began arriving. Indigenous media outlets, environmental journalists, and even international reporters started making their way to the remote village. Social media amplified the story with hashtags like #OneIndigenous Rights and Arctic Justice trending nationally. The camera also captured an unexpected moment when Elder Siku approached the news crew carrying a collection of traditional artifacts and family photographs spanning several generations of his family's connection to the land. As he spoke about his grandfather's stories and the spiritual significance of their territory, the camera documented not just political claims, but cultural heritage that gave emotional weight to their legal arguments. "My grandfather hunted these lands before Canada was even a country," Siku told Sarah's camera. "His grandfather before him knew these hunting grounds. We have been here since time began, and our connection to this land goes deeper than any government document." Now, the most dramatic footage came when Dr. Morrison's surviving family members began contacting news organizations. After seeing the CBC broadcast, Morrison's daughter, Margaret, now 78 years old and living in Toronto, called CBC directly during their live coverage to confirm her father's story. "My father never returned from that expedition," Margaret Morrison told Sarah during a live phone interview that was broadcast across the village's gathered crowd. "But before he left, he told my mother that if something happened to him, we should know that he was trying to protect people who were being treated unjustly by their own government." The camera captured the emotional reaction of the villagers as they heard Morrison's daughter confirm their understanding of his sacrifice. It also captured Agent Thompson's visible discomfort as the live broadcast exposed details about the 1952 expedition that the government had kept classified for decades. As evening approached, the village found itself at the center of a national media story that was attracting international attention. Video clips of the confrontation were being shared globally, and indigenous rights organizations from multiple countries were issuing statements of support. But the camera also captured something ominous: additional government vehicles arriving under cover of darkness, suggesting that federal authorities were escalating their response to the media attention. Rather than backing down from their Confrontation with the village, the media attention, brought unexpected allies to the village, but the most significant support came from an unlikely source. Dr. Elena Vasquez, a professor of Arctic Studies at the University of the Arctic, arrived with a leather portfolio containing an official university research grant that would legitimize their struggle in academic and legal circles. The research grant document was more than just academic paperwork. It represented institutional backing from one of Canada's most respected northern research institutions. Dr. Vasquez had seen the CBC coverage and immediately recognized the historical significance of Morrison's discovery and the legal implications of the hidden documents. This grant authorizes a comprehensive study of Indigenous land rights and resource management in the Arctic. Dr. Vasquez explained to the assembled village council, under its provisions, your community becomes a protected research site, which gives us legal standing to challenge federal interference with traditional territories. Anna examined the grant documentation carefully. The university's involvement changed everything. Federal agents might intimidate a small Indigenous community, but challenging a major research university with international connections would create diplomatic and academic complications the government wanted to avoid. The grant also brought practical benefits. Dr. Vasquez's team included legal researchers, environmental scientists, and Indigenous rights specialists who could provide expert analysis of Morrison's documents and support the village's claims with academic authority. Within hours of Dr. Vasquez's arrival, additional allies began appearing. A convoy of vehicles from the Assembly of First Nations brought legal advisors and media specialists who understood how to navigate both government bureaucracy and public opinion. Environmental organizations sent representatives who recognized the broader implications of the struggle for sustainable resource development, but the most meaningful support came from other Indigenous communities across the Arctic who had faced similar pressures from resource extraction industries. Leaders from communities in Alaska, Greenland, and northern Siberia began issuing statements of solidarity and sharing their own experiences with government attempts to seize traditional territories. Dr. Vasquez's research team also brought crucial historical context to Morrison's documents. Their analysis revealed that the 1952 uranium project was part of a much larger pattern of government resource seizures from Indigenous communities across Canada. Morrison's hidden evidence wasn't an isolated case, but documentation of systematic violations of Indigenous rights that had continued for decades. Your discovery provides the missing link in a chain of evidence that spans 70 years. Dr. Vasquez told the villagers, Morrison's documents prove that the government has been deliberately concealing Indigenous land rights to facilitate resource extraction. The university's involvement also attracted international attention from Indigenous rights organizations affiliated with the United Nations. Representatives from the UN Working Group on Indigenous Rights issued statements supporting the village's position and calling for investigation of the Canadian government's actions. Agent Thompson found himself increasingly isolated as the coalition of supporters grew. His attempts to maintain federal authority over the situation were undermined by the academic legitimacy of the university research project and the growing international pressure on the Canadian government to respect Indigenous rights. The most significant development came when Morrison's daughter, Margaret, arrived at the village with her father's personal papers, which she had kept private for 70 years. Among these papers was a detailed account of the threats Morrison had received from government agents, written in his own hand as insurance against retaliation. My father wrote this the night before his expedition disappeared, Margaret Morrison told the gathered supporters and media. He wanted there to be a record of what the government was planning, in case something happened to his team. Morrison's personal account corroborated everything the villagers had discovered in his hidden cache, but it also revealed additional details about the government conspiracy that hadn't been included in the official documents. Most importantly, it named specific government officials who had authorized the illegal land seizure operation. Dr. Vasquez's legal team immediately recognized the significance of Morrison's personal testimony. Combined with the official documents from the hidden cache, they now had evidence that could support criminal charges against government officials for conspiracy to violate indigenous rights and theft of traditional territories. As evening fell, the village had transformed from an isolated community under siege into the center of a major human rights campaign with international support. The research grant had provided the legal framework needed to challenge federal authority. While the coalition of allies offered resources and expertise the villagers couldn't have accessed on their own. But Agent Thompson's radio communications, intercepted by Dr. Vasquez's technical team, suggested that the federal government was preparing a final attempt to seize control of the situation before it spiraled completely beyond their ability to manage. The federal court hearing took place in Yellowknife 2 weeks later, in a modern courthouse that felt alien to many of the villagers who had never participated in formal legal proceedings. The most important artifact in the courtroom wasn't ancient or hidden, but thoroughly contemporary. The court stenographer's digital recording device that would create an official record of everything said during the proceedings. Judge Patricia Caldwell presided over the emergency injunction hearing with the gravity appropriate to a case that had attracted national attention. The stenographer's record would become part of Canadian legal history, documenting the first time that pre-Confederation Indigenous land rights had been tested against Federal Resource Extraction Authority. Nayak sat in the front row of the courtroom gallery, wearing his best suit and carrying the leather case that contained Morrison's original documents. Beside him, Anna held copies of the legal deed, while Elder Siku wore traditional ceremonial clothing that honored the significance of the proceedings. The government's legal team, led by Senior Crown Attorney Michael Ross, presented their argument first. They claimed that national security interests and economic development need superseded local land claims, particularly when those claims were based on documents that had never been properly filed or recognized by federal authorities. Your Honor, Attorney Ross argued, these documents, regardless of their historical interest, do not constitute legally binding land transfers. The Crown's authority over natural resources in the territories is clearly established under the Constitution Act and subsequent federal legislation. But the village's legal team, led by Indigenous rights lawyer David Sinclair and supported by Dr. Vasquez's research, presented a compelling counter-argument based on prior occupation rights and treaty obligations that predated Confederation. Your Honor, Sinclair responded, the documents discovered by my clients prove that the federal government has been aware of Indigenous land rights in this area since 1952. The government's own lawyers concluded in internal documents that the planned land seizure violated existing treaty obligations and international law. The stenographer's fingers moved rapidly across her specialized keyboard as witness after witness took the stand. Anna testified about the discovery of Morrison's cache and the significance of the legal deed. Dr. Vasquez provided expert testimony about the historical context of government land seizures from indigenous communities, but the most powerful testimony came from Elder Siku, who spoke for over an hour about his family's connection to the traditional territory spanning 7 generations. The stenographer captured not just his words, but the emotional weight of his testimony as he described how his ancestors had used and protected the land, long before any European government claimed authority over it. My great-great-grandfather knew every stream, every hunting ground, every sacred place in this territory, Siku testified. He taught my great-grandfather, who taught my grandfather, who taught me. This is not just land to us. It is who we are. The government's case weakened considerably when Morrison's daughter Margaret took the stand and presented her father's personal papers. The stenographer recorded her testimony about conversations with her father before his final expedition, including his concerns about government threats against indigenous communities. "My father was a scientist, but he was also a man of conscience," Margaret testified. "He told my mother that if something happened to him, it would be because he refused to participate in what he called a grave injustice against people who had done nothing wrong except live on land that contained valuable minerals." The most damaging testimony for the government came from retired civil servant Robert Chen, who had worked in the Department of Natural Resources during the 1950s and 1960s. Chen testified that government officials had deliberately concealed evidence of indigenous land rights to facilitate resource extraction projects. "We knew about the legal complications," Chen testified, "but the uranium was too valuable and the communities were too small and isolated to fight back effectively. The decision was made at the highest levels to proceed regardless of legal obstacles." Judge Caldwell listened to 5 days of testimony before calling for final arguments. The stenographer's record showed that the government's position had shifted from claiming absolute authority to arguing that practical considerations required federal oversight of resource development. Attorney Ross made a final plea for federal authority, "Your Honor, regardless of historical injustices, the practical reality is that resource development of this magnitude requires federal coordination and oversight. The security of Canada's energy future cannot be held hostage to local land claims." But Sinclair's closing argument, captured word for word by the stenographer, focused on the rule of law and the government's obligation to respect Indigenous rights, even when economically inconvenient. "Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about whether the Canadian government is bound by its own laws and treaty obligations. If we allow economic interests to override legal rights, we undermine the very foundation of justice in this country." Judge Caldwell announced that she would deliver her decision the following Friday, giving both sides time to prepare for whatever consequences would follow. Judge Caldwell entered the packed courtroom carrying the most symbolically powerful artifact in the Canadian legal system, the ceremonial gavel that represents the authority of justice itself. The polished wood and brass instrument had presided over countless decisions, but rarely over a case with such far-reaching implications for Indigenous rights and federal authority. The courtroom fell silent as Judge Caldwell took her position behind the bench. Nayak gripped Anna's hand tightly while Elder Siku closed his eyes in prayer. Dr. Vasquez and her legal team sat ready with prepared statements for either outcome, while government attorneys looked tense and prepared for an appeal regardless of the decision. In the matter of the Aurora Village Band versus the Crown, Judge Caldwell began, her voice carrying the weight of judicial authority. "This court has carefully considered all evidence presented regarding traditional territory rights, federal resource authority, and the legal validity of historical land deeds." She paused to review her notes before continuing. "With the decision that would change everything, the evidence presented demonstrates conclusively that the federal government has been aware of Indigenous land rights in the disputed territory since 1952. Internal government documents show that the Crown's own legal advisors concluded that proceeding with resource extraction without Indigenous consent would violate existing treaty obligations and constitutional principles." Anna felt her heart racing as the judge's words began to outline a favorable decision. Furthermore, the legal deed presented by the plaintiffs, properly witnessed and executed according to territorial law in effect at the time, establishes clear Indigenous ownership of the traditional territory, including subsurface mineral rights. The government's failure to recognize this deed for 70 years does not invalidate its legal authority. Judge Caldwell lifted her gavel, and the symbolic weight of the moment was not lost on anyone present. Therefore, this court grants the injunction requested by the plaintiffs. The federal government is hereby enjoined from any resource extraction activities in the disputed territory without explicit consent from the Aurora Village Band. Additionally, this court recognizes the legal validity of the 1952 land deed and orders the federal government to formally acknowledge indigenous ownership of the traditional territory. The gavel came down with a decisive strike that echoed through the courtroom and marked a historic victory for indigenous rights. The packed gallery erupted in cheers from supporters, while government attorneys immediately began discussing appeal procedures with their clients. But Judge Caldwell wasn't finished. She had additional orders that would ensure the decision's enforcement. Given the evidence of historical government misconduct in this matter, this court orders the establishment of an oversight committee to monitor compliance with indigenous land rights in the Arctic territories. This committee will include representatives from affected indigenous communities, academic institutions, and international indigenous rights organizations. The judge's final words address the broader implications of her decision. This case demonstrates that legal rights do not diminish with time or government indifference. The rule of law requires that all citizens, including indigenous peoples, receive equal protection under the Constitution, regardless of economic or political pressures to the contrary. Outside the courthouse, the victory celebration was tempered by the realization that their struggle was far from over. Government attorneys immediately announced their intention to appeal the decision to higher courts, and federal officials issued statements claiming that national security interests required continued federal oversight of Arctic resource development. Dr. Vasquez addressed the media, gathering with a clear understanding of the challenges ahead. Today's decision establishes an important legal precedent, but we must remain vigilant. The government has significant resources and will likely pursue every available avenue to overturn or circumvent this ruling. Elder Siku spoke to the assembled supporters with the wisdom of someone who had seen many struggles. This victory belongs to all our people, not just our village. But we must remember that winning in court is only the beginning. Now we must prove we can protect our land responsibly. The legal victory created new challenges for the village. Mining companies began approaching them directly with partnership proposals. Environmental groups sought to establish the area as a protected wilderness, and government agencies started requesting consultation on resource development policies. Anna found herself appointed as the village's primary liaison with outside organizations, a role that required her to navigate complex legal and political relationships while protecting her community's interests. The responsibility was overwhelming, but it was also an opportunity to influence policy decisions that would affect indigenous communities across the Arctic. As they prepared to return home, Nayak realized that Morrison's 70-year-old sacrifice had finally achieved its purpose. The hidden evidence had not only protected their land rights, but had also established legal precedents that would benefit indigenous communities throughout Canada. But their celebration was interrupted by news that international mining corporations were already developing strategies to circumvent the court decision. Through direct negotiations with individual community members, 3 months after their legal victory, the village faced a new type of pressure that proved more challenging than government intimidation. Arctic Minerals International, one of the world's largest mining corporations, arrived with a leather portfolio containing a development contract that offered the community more money than they had ever imagined possible. The mining company contract was a masterpiece of legal engineering, designed to appear generous while maintaining corporate control over every aspect of resource development. The document promised immediate payments of $50 million to the community, followed by annual royalty payments that could reach hundreds of millions over the life of the mining operation. Corporate representative James Morrison, no relation to Dr. Morrison, despite the coincidental name, presented the offer to a packed community meeting with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to making deals that changed entire regions. He wore an expensive suit and carried presentation materials that made their struggle against government agents seem simple by comparison. This partnership represents a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Morrison told the assembled villagers, "Your community could become one of the wealthiest in the Arctic while maintaining complete ownership of your traditional territory." The contract terms seemed almost too good to be true, which immediately raised suspicions among the more cautious community members. The corporation would handle all mining operations, environmental compliance, and infrastructure development while paying the village substantial compensation for mineral rights access. But Anna's careful review of the contract revealed concerning details hidden in complex legal language. The development agreement would grant the corporation exclusive rights to mining operations for 99 years, effectively removing community control over their land for multiple generations. "Look at this section," Anna pointed out during the community meeting. "They're requesting rights to all mineral extraction, not just uranium. That includes any future discoveries of rare earth elements, precious metals, or other valuable materials." Elder Siku studied the contract with deep skepticism. Why would outsiders offer us so much money unless they expect to make much more for themselves? The corporate presentation included detailed environmental impact assessments and community benefit plans that promised minimal disruption to traditional hunting and fishing activities. The mining operation would be conducted using the latest technology designed to minimize environmental damage while maximizing resource extraction efficiency. Young families in the village were particularly attracted to the financial security the contract offered. Mary Kanguk, the single mother who had spoken in favor of development during earlier community meetings, saw the contract as an opportunity to ensure her children's future. $50 million could fund education for every child in our community for generations, Mary argued. We could build a modern school, provide university scholarships, and create economic opportunities that don't depend on outside charity or government assistance. But the contract also revealed the corporation's understanding of community dynamics. Different sections offered varying compensation levels for different families based on their traditional territory usage patterns, creating potential divisions between community members who would benefit more or less from the agreement. Tunu, who had completed his engineering degree and returned to the village, provided technical analysis of the proposed mining operation. His review raised serious concerns about long-term environmental consequences that weren't adequately addressed in the corporate environmental assessments. They're proposing open-pit mining in areas that include watershed sources for our traditional hunting grounds, Tunu explained. The environmental impact would be permanent, affecting not just our generation, but all future generations. The community found itself divided between those who saw the contract as financial salvation and those who viewed it as a sophisticated form of colonization that would ultimately destroy their traditional way of life. The divisions were particularly painful because they cut across family lines, with different generations holding fundamentally different views about progress and preservation. Dr. Vasquez, who had remained involved as an advisor to the community, provided historical context about similar mining agreements in other indigenous territories. Her research showed that corporate partnerships often began with generous terms, but evolved over time to favor corporate interests at the expense of community rights. The pattern is consistent across multiple continents, Dr. Vasquez warned. Initial agreements promise community control and environmental protection, but contract modifications over time typically reduce community authority while expanding corporate rights. The debate continued for weeks, with the corporation maintaining pressure for a quick decision while community members struggled to balance immediate financial benefits against long-term cultural and environmental concerns. As the deadline for responding to the contract approached, mysterious equipment failures began affecting the village's communication systems, making it difficult to consult with outside legal advisors or indigenous rights organizations. With their communication systems mysteriously failing and pressure mounting from the mining corporation, Elder Siku made a decision that surprised everyone. He retrieved the traditional talking stick from his family's ceremonial collection, an ancient artifact carved from Arctic willow and decorated with symbols representing the voices of all community members throughout history. The talking stick was more than just a ceremonial object. It represented the democratic process that had guided indigenous communities for countless generations before European contact. Under traditional protocols, whoever held the talking stick had the right to speak without interruption, and all community members had the obligation to listen with respect and consideration. We will decide this matter the way our ancestors decided important questions, Siku announced to the divided community, with patience, wisdom, and respect for all voices. The talking stick ceremony took place in the community hall over the course of 3 days, with every adult member of the village given the opportunity to hold the stick and share their thoughts about the mining contract. The process was deliberately slow, designed to ensure that all perspectives were heard and considered before any decision was made. Mary Kanguk was the first to take the talking stick, and she spoke passionately about the opportunities the mining contract could provide for their children. My daughter dreams of becoming a doctor, but we don't have the resources to support her education. This contract could make her dreams possible for her and for every child in our community. Others spoke about immediate practical needs that the mining revenue could address. The village needed infrastructure improvements, better healthcare facilities, and economic opportunities that would allow young people to build careers without leaving their traditional territory. But when Tunu took the talking stick, he shared detailed analysis of the contract terms that revealed hidden costs the corporation hadn't emphasized. The 99-year lease essentially means we're selling our children's inheritance. They'll have no control over their traditional territory for their entire lifetimes. Anna spoke about the legal implications of the contract language, explaining how seemingly minor clauses could be interpreted to expand corporate authority far beyond what was being presented to the community. They're asking us to trust them to interpret this contract fairly for nearly a century. That's a lot of trust to place in people whose primary obligation is to their shareholders, not to our community. Elder Siku held the talking stick for the longest period, sharing stories from his grandfather about previous encounters with outside interests who had promised prosperity in exchange for access to traditional territories. The pattern is always the same, he said quietly. They arrive with generous offers. They establish operations that change everything, and then they leave when the resources are exhausted. But we remain, and we must live with whatever they leave behind. The talking stick ceremony also included voices from the youngest adult members of the community, including recent high school graduates who would live with the consequences of the decision for most of their lives. Several spoke about wanting economic opportunities that didn't require abandoning their cultural identity or traditional relationship with the land. On the second day of the ceremony, Dr. Vasquez was invited to hold the talking stick and share research about sustainable development models that other indigenous communities had successfully implemented. Her presentation described partnerships that maintained community control while allowing carefully managed resource development. The key is maintaining decision-making authority, Dr. Vasquez explained. Successful indigenous corporate partnerships are structured so that the community retains the right to modify or terminate agreements. If they're not working as intended, the talking stick process also revealed creative alternatives that hadn't been considered during the heated debates about accepting or rejecting the mining contract. Several community members proposed negotiating a modified agreement that would limit mining operations to specific areas while preserving the most culturally and environmentally sensitive. The territory's Tunu suggested establishing a community-controlled development corporation that could partner with outside interests while maintaining local authority over all decisions. We could use our legal victory to create our own development model rather than accepting someone else's terms. As the third day of the talking stick ceremony concluded, a consensus began emerging around the idea of sustainable development that respected both economic needs and cultural values. The community wasn't ready to reject development entirely, but they also weren't willing to surrender control of their future to outside corporations. Anna proposed using the talking stick process to develop their own terms for any partnership, terms that would protect their sovereignty while addressing their economic needs. Instead of responding to their contract, we should present our own proposal that reflects our values and priorities. The ceremony ended with the talking stick being placed in the center of the community hall, where it would remain until a final decision was reached through continued discussion and consensus building. 1 year after their legal victory, Nayak stood once again at the Aurora viewing ground, but this time he wasn't alone. Tunu knelt beside the ancient stone circle, carefully placing a sealed metal time capsule into a specially prepared vault that would preserve their story for future generations. The time capsule represented hope that their struggle and success would guide others facing similar challenges. The new time capsule contained copies of all the documents they had discovered, from Morrison's original journal to the court decision that had established their land rights. But it also included new materials, photographs of their community meetings, recordings of the talking stick ceremonies, and detailed accounts of how they had balanced traditional wisdom with modern legal strategies. Future generations should know that ordinary people can protect what matters most when they work together with courage and wisdom, Nayak said as they sealed the capsule. The viewing ground had been officially designated as a protected cultural heritage site, ensuring that this sacred place would never be disturbed by mining operations. The village had ultimately negotiated a groundbreaking partnership agreement that allowed limited, sustainable mining while maintaining community control over all development decisions. Instead of accepting the corporation's 99-year lease, they had established a community-controlled development corporation with the authority to approve or reject all mining activities on 5-year renewable terms. Anna served as the Development Corporation's first president, using her legal knowledge to ensure that all agreements protected indigenous rights while generating revenue for community improvements. The partnership had already funded a new school, a modern health clinic, and scholarship programs that allowed young people to pursue higher education while maintaining their connection to traditional territory. Tunu had returned from completing his environmental engineering master's degree to oversee the technical aspects of the mining operations. His role ensured that traditional environmental knowledge was integrated with modern technology to minimize ecological impact while maximizing community benefits. The sustainable mining operation employed primarily community members and operated according to strict environmental protocols that protected watershed areas, wildlife migration routes, and culturally significant sites. Mining activities were suspended during traditional hunting seasons and spiritual ceremonies, demonstrating that economic development and cultural preservation could coexist. Elder Siku, now 94, had lived to see his grandfather's prophecies fulfilled. The sleeping spirits beneath the Aurora viewing ground had been awakened not with destructive force, but with respect and ceremony that honored both ancient wisdom and modern needs. He had become an advisor to indigenous communities across the Arctic who faced similar resource development pressures. Dr. Vasquez's research center had established a permanent presence in the village, creating a unique collaboration between academic researchers and traditional knowledge holders. Their joint projects had produced innovative approaches to Arctic resource management that were being studied and replicated throughout the circumpolar north. The village had also become a model for other indigenous communities seeking to balance economic development with cultural preservation. Delegations from Alaska, Greenland, and Siberia visited regularly to learn about their partnership model and legal strategies for protecting traditional territories. Margaret Morrison, Dr. Morrison's daughter, had established a scholarship fund in her father's memory that supported Indigenous students pursuing careers in environmental science and law. Her father's sacrifice had finally achieved its intended purpose, protecting Indigenous peoples from government and corporate exploitation, while ensuring they could benefit from the resources on their traditional territories. The time capsule also contained letters from community children describing their hopes for the future. These letters expressed pride in their heritage, excitement about educational opportunities, and determination to protect their land for their own children and grandchildren. As the aurora began its nightly dance overhead, Nayak reflected on the journey that had brought them from Morrison's frozen safe to this moment of hope and determination. The northern lights seemed to celebrate their achievements, painting the sky with the same green and blue radiance that had guided their ancestors for countless generations. The sealed time capsule would remain at the viewing ground for 50 years, before being opened by future generations who would face their own challenges and opportunities. Inside, they would find not just the story of how one community had protected its rights, but a blueprint for how traditional wisdom and modern law could work together to create justice. Tunu stood beside his father as they watched the aurora dance above the ancient stone circle. "Do you think we made the right choices, Father?" Nayak smiled, remembering Morrison's words about the importance of protecting people who were being treated unjustly by forces beyond their control. "We honored the past, protected the present, and created possibilities for the future. That's the most any generation can do." The Aurora viewing ground would continue to be a sacred place where the spirits of the northern lights danced, with the hopes and dreams of people who understood that true wealth comes from maintaining the balance between what the earth provides and what future generations will need.